thank you for inviting me this evening. And I don't have a watch and I don't see a clock, so you feel free to stop me because I don't think you want me to go on for 2.5 hours. Some people might starve in the process, which wouldn't serve the purposes of a humanitarian meeting. I met some very special people here in my very brief stay, but still memories. I met a psychiatrist and a social worker, both of whom told me I looked terrible, and I suspect that was a Zionist psychological attack to try to shatter my self-esteem. It didn't work. But most importantly, I met 2 wonderful young people, and I'll walk away with their memories, each of them just for a moment, but at my point in life, you can figure out a person very quickly and see who's worthy of being remembered. So first of all, there's Sam, who I'd like to stand up so people can meet him. And I know that Sam is destined for greatness, so I want to be able to partake of that. Remember to remember me when you make it. And also Akhlaq, who I only spoke to for 2 minutes, but that was quite enough. As you can see, he refuses to get up. I assumed that he was of Pakistani descent, and being of my assumption Pakistani descent, I asked, of course, you're going to be a doctor. Pakistanis are rapidly displacing Jews as the doctors of the world, but he said no. I asked, well, then what do you want to be? And he said, an aid worker. And that was all I need to hear, because it's very seldom in this world that you meet a 9th grader whose aspiration in life is to be an aid worker. And so you're my second vivid memory that I will carry with me from Scotland. I was asked to speak this evening on what happened in Gaza about 13 months ago between July 8th and August 26th, those 51 days. Those 51 days followed soon after the 22 days of Operation Cast Lead during 2008-9, what Amnesty International called the 22 days of death and destruction, referring to Operation Cast Lead. And in fact, I think many people here will be surprised, even though it's been 3 major Israeli assaults on Gaza since 2008-9, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, and then Operation Protective Edge in 2014. There have actually been, since 2004, there have been about 8 or 9 Israeli assaults on Gaza. There was Operation Hot Winter, Operation Autumn Rain, just a non-stop assault on this defenseless civilian population, which is very painful to read about, and it almost is not digestible how many assaults this tiny pinprick on the world's map, how many assaults it's been subjected to in these high-tech massacres committed by Israel. There are a number of things to say about this last assault, and it would take me some time to go through them, and we don't have that time. So I'll just try to look at some of the major points, in my opinion, of misinformation and or disinformation about what happened in 2014, July, August 2014. The first thing I would want to say as a preliminary remark is that it was a particularly dispiriting aftermath to what happened in those 2 months, because in general, in the past, the human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and even the UN Human Rights Council reports, they've generally been fairly accurate, in fact, I would say very accurate, in their depiction of what happened during these various Israeli massacres. But in the past Israeli assault, it's simply not true. The aftermath was extremely dispiriting because the human rights reports, in particular the ones by Amnesty International, were altogether dishonest. And I don't say that with glee, I say that with great sadness. They were altogether dishonest about what happened in Gaza. And the UN Human Rights Report, the one that was chaired by Mary McGowan Davis, was just, it was a travesty, it was a disgrace, and unsurprisingly, it was quickly forgotten. As most of you in the room know, after Cast Lead, the Goldstone report created this hysteria in Israel, and there was a large aftermath to Operation Cast Lead. It remained in the news for quite a long time, mostly because of the Goldstone report, until the pressures exerted on Richard Goldstone, exactly what they were, we still don't know, but they proved unbearable for him. And at some point, he retracted what he wrote in the report. In the case of Operation Protective Edge, it was quite quickly forgotten. It's already pretty much old news, even though the devastation during Operation Protective Edge was on a scale of about 50% higher, greater in magnitude than what happened during Operation Cast Lead. In Operation Cast Lead, there were about 1,400 people killed, about 1,200 were civilians. Operation Protective Edge, it was 2,200 people killed, about 1,600 civilians. If you look at the comparisons across the board, Operation Protective Edge was about 50% worse on all of the so-called metrics, but it got much less, had much less of a aftermath or repercussions. It was fairly quickly forgotten. So it's been, as you look back, one doesn't even have the benefit of, if you can call the benefit of at least the truth enduring of the massacre. It's been mostly lies, and it has to be said, as I've already said, that the human rights organizations and the UN Human Rights Council are now party to those lies. So let's just go quickly through some of the salient points. And I'm not afraid of being stopped because I recognize we have time constraints. So somebody feel free to just raise your hand when it's time for me to end, and we'll just end wherever I am. Let's start with the basics. I don't want to go through the background of why Israel actually launched Operation Protective Edge. Let's just go straight away to Israel's formal claims. And let's see if any of them stand up to serious scrutiny. So Israel begins by claiming on July 8th that it has to attack Gaza. It began, as most of you recall, with an air assault. They claim that they're attacking Gaza because of the Hamas. I'll use Hamas, the shorthand for the various militant groups in Gaza. They've said because of the Hamas rocket attacks. It was the Hamas rocket attacks, and as President Obama never tired of saying through the whole period in what must be called stupefying cowardice, he kept saying that Israel has the right to self-defense, referring to those rocket attacks. Well, let's look at the basics of that claim that Israel had the right of self-defense because of Hamas rocket attacks. Everybody agrees, there's no dispute whatsoever, everybody agrees that Hamas had one bottom line demand. Meet this demand and the rocket attacks will cease. There's no dispute. The demand was end the blockade of Gaza, lift the siege of Gaza. That was their demand from July 8th. End the siege, lift the blockade, no more Hamas rocket attacks. It's over. Now, the question is, was that a legitimate demand? Forget about moral legitimacy. Let's talk about legal legitimacy, the law, international law. Take the UN Human Rights Council report on the attack on Gaza. I said, and I repeat, it was a dreadful report. It was a travesty. However, at the end of the report, it states, under international law, the blockade of Gaza has to be lifted, and I'm quoting them, has to be lifted immediately and unconditionally. Immediately and unconditionally. So, if Israel wanted the rocket attacks to stop, all it had to do was meet its legal obligation under the law. Lift the blockade immediately and unconditionally. So there was no justification from the point of view of the law of self-defense, because self-defense only comes into play when you have exhausted all diplomatic options. They had a diplomatic option, end the blockade. That's the law. Now, the second claim came on July 17th when Israel launched the ground invasion of Gaza, 10 days after the air assault. Most of you will recall in the room, the claim for the ground invasion was the Hamas tunnels, what were called the terror tunnels. Was that a legitimate demand? There are many things to say about those so-called terror tunnels. If time allows, I'll talk a little bit about them. But for the moment, we're looking at the simple question. Was that a legitimate grounds for attacking Gaza? For destroying, as the previous speaker noted, 19,000 homes. Was that a legitimate demand? Or a legitimate grounds? There's a simple way to test that. It's called using your common sense. Everybody in this room knows that there was a proliferating tunnel system between Gaza and the Egyptian Sinai. There were about 1,000 tunnels that were dug between Gaza and the Egyptian Sinai. Now, when Sisi came to power in Egypt, the first thing he wanted to do was to terminate that tunnel traffic. And in fact, eventually, the Egyptians were quite successful. By the time of the attack on Gaza, there was no longer any tunnel economy between Gaza and Egypt. Well, why do I mention it? The answer is obvious. Did Egypt have to attack Gaza to terminate the tunnel economy? They did it from their side of the border. You might not like the way they did it, and I don't like the way they did it because they displaced thousands of thousands of civilians along the Egyptian side of the border, but on the Sinai side of the border. But there was a way to do it. It didn't require bombarding, devastating, shattering, and destroying Gaza. Ask yourself a simple question. In order for the people in Gaza to dig those tunnels, in order for them to dig those tunnels, they had only the most basic of earth-moving equipment. For those of you familiar with it, they were using very basic implements. Obvious reason, you can't get anything into Gaza that's sophisticated in terms of earth-moving equipment. Can anyone in this room possibly believe, is it even conceivable that Israel didn't have earth-moving equipment that can dig a hole deeper than the tunnels and simply flood them, which is what Sisi did on his side of the border? You could have just flooded the tunnels, dig as the Egyptians did, a trench along the border, and that would have been the end of it. I'm not saying I support it, but I'm simply saying as a factual matter, there was an alternative, there was an option other than devastating, destroying, shattering, annihilating Gaza. And what's most striking when you read all of the literature on the topic, which I have read, nobody makes that obvious point. They just accept as true the Israeli claims about why they attacked Gaza. It had nothing to do with the tunnels. It had nothing to do with the rockets. That's just completely false. I could see you're getting anxious, so you tell me when to stop. Don't feel embarrassed. Don't worry about it. I won't take it personally. Just to mention a couple of other things on that point. It's very striking when you read the human rights reports, the desperate attempts in these reports, the desperate attempt to pretend some kind of balance. Both sides suffered. Both sides are victims. Is that really an accurate, a fair description of what happened? Let's look at some numbers. It's true numbers don't tell the full story, but for sure they tell part of the story. So let's look at the numbers. Remind me of your name, sir. No, yours. The previous speaker, yeah. Qasim? Okay, so Qasim mentioned 19,000 homes in Gaza were rendered uninhabitable. Do you know how many Israeli homes were rendered uninhabitable? You will never, I assure you, not in one single publication will you see the number. Because I had to trace it down. I finally found it on an Israeli Foreign Affairs website. You know what the number is? 1. 1. 19,000 to 1. Does that sound like a balanced conflict? 550 Israeli children were killed. Do you know how many Israeli children were killed? 1. 550 to 1. The estimate is Hamas rockets altogether, they may have, probably this is an overestimate, they may have altogether had a total explosive tonnage, maybe of about 50 tons altogether. The rockets and the mortar shells. Altogether, maybe 50 tons. Do you know what the estimate is of the explosive tonnage that was dropped on Gaza? 20,000 tons. 50 versus 20,000 tons. Actually, just on the tiny little place called Shujaya, in I think maybe one day, I think it was one day, in Shujaya, Israel dropped over 100 one-ton bombs. Over 100 one-ton bombs on Shujaya. In the case of Rafah, they fired 2,000 high artillery shells and bombs, 2,000 on one day, August 1st, 1,000 in the first 3 hours. And yet there's this pretense that both sides suffered equally during the conflict. Not a single one of the major human rights organizations, except Amnesty in its last report, and that's only after I delivered a really harsh attack on them, which I think they took into account in that last report. They seemed to acknowledge what happened during 2014 summer was slightly imbalanced. Now, another fact that would be of interest to a large number of people in this audience, maybe all people in this audience, which was not mentioned in a single human rights report, and in fact was not even mentioned by the previous speaker. If you go through all the human rights reports, I have gone through every single one quite carefully. You go through all of them, they will mention the hospitals that were attacked in Gaza. They will mention the ambulances that were attacked in Gaza. They will mention the schools that were attacked in Gaza. But do you know what not one human rights report mentions? 200 mosques in Gaza were attacked. 70 of them were completely destroyed. 200 mosques. Now ask yourself a simple question. If Hamas had destroyed 70 Israeli synagogues, would we have heard about it? If Hamas had destroyed or damaged 200 synagogues, would we have heard about it? But even the Muslims organizations, I have to say, didn't mention 200 mosques were damaged or destroyed in Gaza during the 2014 assault. It doesn't even register. That's the depths we've reached. It doesn't even register. The UN report on Gaza devoted large amounts of space to the emotional and psychological anguish and torment suffered by Israelis during the past attack. And for all I know, some of it is probably true. But why is it that in a deeply religious place like Gaza, it doesn't even register? It's not even mentioned, the kind of emotional and psychological damage that's being inflicted when you are systematically targeting the mosques in Gaza. Now, I only have a few minutes time left, so I want to just go through a couple of other basic facts, because my utility in life, I've found, judging from my email correspondence and meeting people, I'm not by nature a celebrity. My calling in life is simply to read and report, as far as I can tell, what's true. Somebody asked me why, if you flew into Glasgow a few hours ago, which is true, why are you leaving tomorrow morning and you'll be home about one day after you left? And the answer is because I always get very nervous about becoming a jet setter, as we used to call it in my day, and becoming reduced to a celebrity, because I know from my email correspondence and from meeting people that the thing they value in me the most, they say, how is it that you always manage to remain calm? You never get angry when you're talking, you just patiently wait your turn, and then you respond in complete calm with full command. And the answer is very simple. The answer is, the reason people get angry and frustrated and they start shouting, it's because they know what the other side is saying is not true, but they don't know how to answer. They know intuitively that's got to be a lie, but they don't know why. The moment you have command of the facts, you never get angry. You just patiently wait your turn, and then you can answer. And I've found that that's what people look for in me, and that's the roundabout way of saying that's why I have to get home. I've got to work, because if I don't work, then I feel like I've let people like the people in this room down. They're not looking for a celebrity. They're looking for somebody who can rationally and calmly dispose of and expose the lies. So that's my job, and I want to just look at two other aspects of what happened, and that's it, and then I'm on my way. The whole question of these rocket attacks that were launched by Israel, leaving aside the issue, as I said, it was very easy for Israel to defend itself against those attacks. All it had to do was obey the law, lift the blockade. But there's a second question. Were there Hamas rocket attacks on Israel? There weren't any. It's simply a complete myth. Unfortunately, both sides in the conflict had a stake in preserving, cultivating that myth. I could see this woman here is wondering, what's he talking about? Well, then let's again look at the facts. There were 5,000 Hamas, quote-unquote, rockets fired at Israel, 2,000 mortar shells fired at Israel, altogether 7,000 projectiles. What damage did they cause? They caused, as I already said, one house was destroyed, and there were 6 civilians killed, 5 Israelis and 1 foreign worker. So the obvious question is, how could 7,000 projectiles cause only destruction to one house and 6 civilian deaths? There's something wrong in that equation. Now, some of you in this room who think you're cleverer than me, you're thinking, but the professor, the good professor, he's leaving out Iron Dome, that miracle anti-missile defense system that Israel created. Is that correct? Have I left out Iron Dome? Well, let's look at the facts. According to Israel itself, Iron Dome was only located in the populated areas of Israel, the populated cities, mostly in the north. Only 815 of those projectiles actually reached those areas. Of those 815, Iron Dome, they claim Israel, it deflected 720. They say 90%. In fact, one of the world's leading experts on anti-missile technology, Theodore Postel of MIT, he says Iron Dome only worked about 5% of the time. It's all a myth. 5% would mean about, well, you can do the math, 5% of 800 would mean about 40 rockets, projectiles were deflected. But even if you take the Israeli numbers, let's accept their numbers, which are false, 720, that still leaves 6,000 rockets and mortar shells. How could 6,000 have only destroyed one house and 6 civilians? But there's more. Of the 6 civilians, 5 were killed by the mortar shells. That means one Israeli, one was killed by the 5,000 rockets. One. And you know why? Because they weren't rockets. They were enhanced fireworks. There were no rockets. Anybody with a moment's common sense understands there couldn't have been rockets. Because whatever rockets Hamas had, they basically used up during Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012. But then shortly after Operation Pillar of Defense, in November 2012, Sisi came to power in July 2013, flooded the tunnels. Nothing could get into Gaza. There weren't Iranian rockets and Syrian rockets. There was nothing. It was shut off. They had nothing. They fired these things they called rockets. Unfortunately, both sides, as I said, had a stake in pretending they were rockets. Israel, so it could claim it was acting in self-defense, and Hamas, so it could claim that armed resistance was working. But in both cases, the claim was false. That leaves us the question of the tunnels. I'll say a couple of quickly things about the tunnels and then I'm done. Number one, Israel claims to have destroyed 32 tunnels that went from Gaza into Israel. Of those 32, no, they destroyed 32 tunnels. Of those 32, only 12 actually went under the border from Gaza to Israel. 12. But there's much more to it. There's much more to it. Because even if you read the UN report on Gaza, which I repeat for the third time, it's a travesty, they make the important point: the tunnels, the militants who infiltrated Israel, they never, not once, never targeted civilians. When they exited from the tunnels, they engaged in armed exchanges with the Israeli military. All the talk about terror tunnels, under living rooms, beside kibbutzim, was all a lie. The tunnels were designed only to engage Israeli combatants. Now, the UN report says we don't know exactly what the goal was, but as a factual matter, the UN report says they never targeted civilians. It just wasn't true. In that sense, you have to say Hamas got smarter because it recognized Israeli society. It's a very strange society. And I don't say that to evoke laughter. It's a peculiar society. One aspect of it is it's a Sparta-like society which values much more combatant lives than civilian lives, and mourns much more the deaths of combatants than civilians. So Hamas got smart and realized if you want to inflict damage on Israel, you have to target combatants. And even though, yes, the tunnels did reach residential areas, that's true, it wasn't the residents they were targeting, it was combatants. Another weird aspect of the society, it's hard to fathom the mentality. Some of you will remember that during the attack on Rafah, the goal was to rescue this guy named Golden, the lieutenant in the Israeli army. But in fact, the goal was not to rescue him. That's not correct. The goal was to kill him, because Israel feared that if Hamas captured him, it would become another Shalit affair. You know, the national mourning and then a huge prisoner exchange, 1,300 Israelis for one Shalit. So it's an odd society, because when Shalit was captured by the Israelis in 2006, the country went into this protracted mourning. Poor Mr. Shalit, poor Mr. Shalit. Everybody had pictures of Shalit. There was so much mourning. Yet, it's a society that prefers to kill a person than for him to be taken captive. Now, the mentality behind that, it eludes me. They would rather him dead. And so in the case of the operation in Rafah, the goal was actually to kill Lieutenant Golden, not to capture him. In any case, on the whole question of the tunnels, the aim of the Israelis was not to destroy the tunnels entering Israel. That's not correct. The aim was to destroy the tunnels in Gaza, within Gaza, because the Palestinians, create a very impressive tunnel system in Gaza. To me, it wasn't surprising, because everybody knows that every Muslim woman and man in Gaza, in the Muslim world, they're all going to be civil engineers. That's just the way it is. Otherwise, their fathers will kill them. And so, in the case of Gaza, you had about 1 million unemployed civil engineers. And so I wasn't altogether surprised when they created this very impressive tunnel system. But the purpose of the attack on Gaza after ground invasion was to destroy the tunnels, because as a matter of fact, the resistance was much more effective than in the past. 67 Israeli soldiers were killed during Operation Protective Edge. During Operation Cast Lead, it was 10 Israeli soldiers killed, and of those 10, half were killed by other Israelis. It was what's called friendly fire. So there was a fairly effective fairly effective, relatively speaking, Palestinian resistance, and part of it was because of the tunnels, because it was impossible to disable the tunnels from the air, and so you had to go in through a ground invasion to disable them. And so basically Israel's view is that every few years it has to attack Gaza, what's called mowing the lawn in Israel. That's the phrase they use to remind the people of Gaza who's in charge, but when they go in to mow the lawn, they don't want to lose as many casualties as they did in the last attack, so they want to destroy the whole tunnel system. They weren't able to for various reasons, but the basic facts are everything you were told about the rockets and the tunnels was just completely false, in my opinion, for reasons which I've already expressed. And that's where I will leave it, except to say that the whole program today, which I deeply appreciated the whole program today, because it was very practical. It was very impressive. We're going to speak with the doctors, we're going to speak with the businessmen, and we're going to see what we can get done. It was brass tacks, no celebrities, no quote-unquote VIPs. Let's talk to the people on the ground, and let's see what we can get done. But everybody recognizes, not least the organizers of today's event, that what they're doing is basically a Band-Aid, because they're talking about $750,000 here, which was donated by the Scottish government, $500,000 there, but Gaza, the minimum estimate is that the damage that was done just from the last attack, was about $4.5 billion. It's a huge undertaking to just get back to zero, get back to square one. So it requires a political solution, and everybody understands that. But in the interim, you do what you can, of course. But it requires a political solution, and what needs to be done in addition to talking about practical, day-to-day ways to lessen the suffering of the people of Gaza is to work together to figure out politically how, first and foremost, politically, how to end that illegal and immoral siege of Gaza, which, as everybody agrees, has to be lifted immediately and unconditionally. And the challenge, in my opinion, is how do we use the statements that are made by the UN Human Rights Council, by Amnesty International, which also said in its last report, the blockade of Gaza has to be lifted immediately and unconditionally. How do we use those statements to build the kind of political movement that can finally at least end that inhuman and illegal inhuman, illegal, and immoral siege of Gaza? Thank you.